Hi, Pirates. Welcome to the Creator Capitalist podcast. We are getting so excited because the book is coming out shortly, just a few days away, just a few weeks, depending on when this goes out. We already have our founding 50 and our first several hundred copies sold. And so it's getting into people's hands. And we're excited to jam more about that today and talk about the category science behind creator capitalists, the no pattern, because anybody can be a creator capitalist. And it's probably the most important thing, not even probably, it is the most important thing in this day and age. So we're so excited to kick this off. And Eddie has done some wonderful data wizarding and category science. So tell us what you discovered, Eddie.
Well, I will admit this wasn't honestly just me. It was a lot of Claude, right? So it was, AI for the win yet again. And so what we did was, and part of what I'm going to nerd out a little bit as somebody who created charts and spreadsheet kung fu and PowerPoint slides for a living is that part of what made this different is it wasn't number crunching that we were doing. We were word crunching. That's kind of one, right? So in the history of analyses and consulting, whatever, right? Usually when you had your data source was a text file of some sort, the best you could do was a word cloud. Everybody's seen these word clouds. They're pretty. The words get bigger the more it gets mentioned. But if you're a data guy, you're like, not really that rigorous. What was cool about this was we uploaded the final kind of part of our book, our 20 profiles of different creator capitalists. So we uploaded that to Claude, and I said, I'd like to do some weird data on this, and is there any kind of pattern here? And the beauty of it was, it wasn't like usually it's a garbage in, garbage out. If you feed it garbage data, it gives you garbage results. This was unstructured data. I did not tell we did not go in and say, "This is a female, this is their age, this is the country that they came from, this is kind of the career that." It just kind of told their stories, and then Claude was able to take it and, do a couple of things. One is, you still need to do the hypothesis stuff, like, is there a pattern? Is there kind of you can't just say, find me something cool, right? And so my hypothesis was, there is no pattern is the pattern. And, the mini book that this podcast is accompanying is this idea of anyone can become a creator capitalist, like Bree mentioned. Much like the movie Ratatouille, the premise is, if those of you who have seen it know that it's this idea of anyone can become a cook versus Anton Ego, the antagonist. The protagonist is a rat named Remy who wants to be a fine dining French chef. And Anton Ego is the critic who says, no, only few people can actually be great cooks. And you have to watch the movie. It's wonderful. But that was the hypothesis that I fed Claude. And then lo and behold, it spat out a bunch of stuff. Now, usually, and Christopher, you can say stuff that won't hurt my feelings, but the analysis I put out usually is pretty dry. Kind of basic. Anyone can, people who grew up in consulting love it. But we got stuff that,
I try to throw spice and bourbon into that stuff whenever it comes across. I'm
yes,
working on it.
yes. So this is what we got back. And couple things. One was the actual format that we created or that came out. I did not do. It came up with this, and actually, it's what's called a JSX file, which I don't even know what that means. But these are screenshots. But you can actually have a file that's embedded where you can click on these types, each of the tabs here. And then it came out with this. It looked like this without our colors. Then I said, look at our website, grab our color scheme, and then lo and behold, boom, it put this out. So this is one of 4 charts, which was, where do our creator capitalists come from? We're so excited about all the different creator capitalists in our book. And as we said, there's 20 of them. Our own Bree is one of them. But when we asked kind of, where did they come from? What was the origin story? Guess what we found was that 7 out of the 20 were what we call deliberate professional reinvention, meaning they were, hey, I have this career and I want to go do something else, right? So our good buddy, Thomas Parrott, was a longtime executive at Beachbody, worked at QVC, Home Shopping Network type places. He was the king of infomercials, and then wanted to become a solopreneur. He founded 8Curve, and he was kind of playing around with, like, is my superpower helping people go from the US to the UK or to the continent? And then after a jam session in the academy and Christopher waving his arms and swearing quite a bit, we came on contribution margin. That was what he was amazing at and what was necessary. And now he's booked out of the wazoo. But that was a very deliberate move that he was trying to make. Versus someone, the next crunch was kind of frustration, trauma, and survival. And these are things that were, you had the legendary Danny Bauer, who, was an amazing award winning principal who was getting his hand slapped because he was doing things that he wasn't supposed to be doing because he was a pirate. Or, Alexis Kowalski, who is one of the estheticians that I know and I've worked with in my with my business ventures with Clint. She was somebody who's a CrossFit queen. She's amazing and jacked, but after graduating from esthetician school, wanted a job as an esthetician and didn't get hired by her favorite derm. And now she started her own company and she makes more than the derm that she was trying to get hired by. Now that's kind of the story of Creator Capitalist. Like the door was shut. Entrepreneurship was not a way up, it was a way out, as Christopher often says. You have folks in the next tranche, hobby, curiosity,
Hold on,
friendship.
hold on,
Yep.
Pirate Eddie. I have to interrupt you. I don't normally like to criticize you, but at the end of such a story, it is very appropriate to hold up one's middle finger and say, "Need an honor," because maybe it's just me, but I think there's some of us creator capitalists who have a little "I'll show you" in us because I've been effed over more than once in my life, and pretty much every time I go, "I'll show you," and then when you win, you get going, "Need an honor."
You know, it's a great point because the Nina and Honor story, it's not in Alexis's nature, but what was amazing was for as an incredible of an entrepreneur she was. I met her maybe 4 years ago, and she was doing great as a solopreneur. She had one facial device and was, really crushing it. And then now, since then, her business has tripled. She's got a team of 3 to 4 people, and she bought a building. So she is not only a business owner, she is a real estate owner. She no longer
She's a
rents for
real
somebody
estate
else.
mogul,
She's a real estate mogul. And
and
in one
what
of the
and the dermatologist is just popping zits.
just the dermatologist wishes he was the pimple popper and the like, right? So, but yeah, I mean, these are the stories. You just never know that the thing that you think you were disappointed by and you were bummed out turned out to be the greatest thing that could have happened to you.
And while there's no particular pattern in terms of people's pathway into becoming creator capitalist, there are sort of buckets there, and there's definitely a bucket called "I got screwed by life, my job, my boss, etc." I had what our dear friend Bruce Feiler would call a life quake that I didn't like, and I feel thrown to the side in one way or another, and I go, "Yeah, I'll show you."
And I think this is really important because and I'm glad you stopped me, Christopher, because if you go back up to the prior bucket of a deliberate professional reinvention, you have kind of amazing people like, Holly Miller, right? She was a director of marketing at Allergan, the number one aesthetics company, took a $25 million business, made it a $100 million business. And then clearly she had the force and started gray matter marketing. Now, some people might say, I don't have that kind of an outcome. I don't have a 9-figure outcome in my track record, or I'm not Mike Maples Jr., CMO of amazing software companies who made a very deliberate transition into Silicon Valley. Like, well, I'm not Mike Maples Jr., so how am I supposed to do that? Or Adam Frankel, who has been a CMO at 3 unicorns in the past and becomes a developer-facing startup guy. These are stories that we love and we respect. They're more of the story that are told. But I think the part that I love of 5, 4, and 4, frustration, trauma, survival, hobby, curiosity, friendship, and accidental discovery, these are the less talked about ones, but they're actually in combination greater than the intentional, I had the pedigree and I had all the goods and then I made the transition.
The other thing that's important to, I think, underscore is it's um it's easy for people to say, "Oh well, when Adam Frankel did it, he'd been a CMO, had lots of money, and so he was choosing to move forward in this part of his career, and he was doing it from a good base." And that's true. However, the interesting thing about that, I'll never forget this. It was the night before Lockhead on Marketing, the podcast was going to ship. And one of our supers posted somewhere, "Oh, I can't wait for this because this is going to be like Bruce Lee on fighting." And I saw that and I went, "Fuck, is it Bruce Lee on fighting?" And so I had a bit of a moment. And in that moment, I literally called Jamie J and Jason DeFilippo and said, "Hey, wait a minute. I think I want to redo the first two episodes." And so, you know, and that was true when I had no money, when I was 18, starting my first business. And it was true a couple years ago when I was trying to do a second podcast. And so if we think about the four capitals, right? Relationship capital, reputation capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital, they all really matter for being a creator capitalist. Even if you're coming at this from a position of financial strength, which is great, the bottom line is whenever you create something that's so personal, and many of the sort of the missions that creator capitalists are on, it's a personal mission why they're doing what they're doing. And so it's very personal. When you care that much about it, you don't want to put out a podcast called Bruce Lee Sucks on Fighting. You want to put out a podcast called Bruce Lee is Awesome.
Amen. Well, and it's funny because I think even what is underneath all of this is, the story, Christopher, you just told. I do think part of what I loved about this experience as a guy that's produced charts and data for, and strategies for his career is that your story of I had a very successful podcast, Legends and Losers, and then I'm doing this. Oh, I got, butterflies, and I don't want to be the Bruce Lee is sucks kind of a guy type of a thing. How do you take that story and turn it into data? And that's what AI is really good at. That, I can do, Bree can
And
do,
data we
Christopher can
never
do.
had before, right? There was no
Yes.
way to deal with it in a spreadsheet or a database.
Yes. It took a lot of judgment and taste to figure out how to organize that into data, and Claude just did it. And right? Because you take Rafi, he's in the hobby, curiosity, friendship one. Like, and again, Rafi could probably fit into a couple of these buckets. Because, and those of you who don't know, Rafi is the category king of pricing. He is the man. Not only has no one written more about pricing in HBR, I think no one has written more in HBR period than Rafi. I think that might be true. And you think about Rafi's story, part of it might seem like in the first bucket. PhD in economics from Cornell, pretty darn good. Consultant at Monitor,
I have a
you know,
PhD from Cornell too, as you know.
absolutely, absolutely. You would
I
have
think
loved
I
the
got a PhD in
hospitality.
drinking there once.
Well, my their most famous class is the wine tasting one. You know that one, right? Like they have a class that's
Well,
on
see,
wine
now you're
tasting, and
talking to me.
you would have been the king of all of that there. Like Rafi went to Monitor, at the time, Michael Porter's, Roger Martin's consulting firm offshoot, one of the most prestigious places to go. And pricing was a curiosity for him. It was not his thing that he did. It was a hobby. And he had some trauma. He went through a riff, got downsides out of Monitor there. But then that opened up the door to get his book out and publish on pricing. And then, lo and behold, accidentally, Monitor says, oops, you're writing a book on pricing? Why don't you come back and work on it so we can take some credit for it as well, too? And then, obviously he launches his solopreneur venture with it. So like, how do you
Which,
put
by the
that,
way, is what's called a full circle Neener Nonner.
all the categories of Neener Nodder, right?
Actually, it might be the circle back Neener Nonner. Actually, I love the circle back Neener Nonner. I've had it happen to me many times in my life. Like in some of the most wicked disagreements I've ever had. I have some amazing stories about this. And when the culprit of the evil doing shows back up later in the hero's story 10 years later, 15 years later, in one case, 20 years later, begging for the hero to come back. It's a circle back Neener Nonner moment.
It's also interesting, similar to Rafi's story. I looked at this and I was like, man, I would not have placed myself in the accidental discovery bucket. So it's kind of peculiar. I would have placed myself in the frustration, trauma, survival. So I think
Mhm.
also all of these stories have this intermixing of all the different elements, whereas there's
Yeah.
maybe the overarching theme and summary and origin, but it's interesting to see myself in accidental discovery when there's all these stories have other elements. You kind of need all of them to become a creator capitalist and fall into that bucket and that persona.
Yes. Well, and you know what I suspect, Bree, is that in the, judgment call of Claude, it read your story and was like, it probably honed in on your rant as because I mean, to your point, everyone can fit in multiple buckets, but what it really highlighted and picked up on was, and I'd love for you to share the story of, you know, uh, how you were getting clients was ranting about basically roasting their websites in public. And, one reached out and was like, this lady has some real truth that she's spitting, and I think she could really help me out here. And I'm guessing you didn't think that was going to happen when you went off and did that. So you need to share a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I didn't expect it. But part of the ranting and the ravings was it came from the frustration of kind of being at this crossroads in business of things are slowly working, kind of working, but I want this breakthrough. I want this to hit the top of the ceiling so many people talk about and achieve and reach. And so that came from, I mean, part of going into a business, it was frustration and trauma and survival because I've shared I got fired from my previous job. And so then I was in my business, which was previously a side hustle, and, when I did the rantings and ravings, that came from the frustration of, "Oh, my financial runway is running out. I need to, like, hit my home run, throw my Hail Mary, do whatever I have to do in order to have this outcome," and that was where the ranting and ravings came from. So if you look at the origin story, there is some accidental discovery back in, like, 2017 when people were like, "Whoa, you're really good at this thing, you should pursue it." But it's interesting to see where it placed me in its data.
Super cool. Super cool. Well, and then if we keep going, one of the things, and again, this is my old analog version. Like you're supposed to click it and it pops up. But the career stage, this was another one that again, it probably is a little bit, some judgment here, but you have slightly more people made the creator capitalist shift in their second or second plus career versus folks who were kind of right out of the gate in the first career. And again, you could argue, as you said, Bree, like you know, what defines a first career versus a second career? Is it in the same lane or whatever? Like Alexis was probably like going to be an esthetician, became an esthetician, then became an owner. So I'd argue in the same career trajectory, and that probably as I'm looking at it, like